Good evening, folks, and welcome to Revising Reality with your host, Tim Kaiser. That's me. Good to hear from you all. And I am hearing something in the background. Give me a second to turn this off. There it is. Anyhow, welcome to the show. We're going to bring in Karin Smith here live, as long as I pronounced that correctly. Karin, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Tim, and it's an honor and a privilege to be on your show tonight.
Yes, and we have an exciting show lined up tonight. We're going to be discussing South Africa and the crazy stuff that's going down right now against the whites, really, at this point. Crazy amount of racism and horrible things being done. And we're going to get into the causes and the facts and what's going on and what we can do to help fix this, if possible, or whatever it is to try to help the people there. Um, I just want to remind our listeners that Revolution Radio is a entirely listener supported website and radio station. And if you need to get access to the archives or buy some seeds, there's some options there for you on the website. So I wanted to cover that really fast, and I want to thank my friend Trinity, who's out there probably listening right now. Who knows if she's online? At any rate, she's the reason why I got this show, and I'm very thankful for that. And she will be back on the air sooner or later. She's out having to move right now, moving to another part of the country. So, with all that covered, let's get into the history of South Africa. Where does all this come from? Like, who first settled in South Africa?
Well, the first people to settle in South Africa were the Dutch. There was a guy called Jan van Riebeck who was sent out by the Dutch East India Company to start a refreshment station at the Cape of Storms in order to resupply the ships going in both directions, collecting silk and spices from the east. Now, he was specifically told he was not there to colonize Africa. He was there only to start a refreshment station in other words, to plant vegetables and fruit and to provide meat for and fresh water for the passing ships.
Hmm.
Well, so when he landed there were no noble savages. There were no black people in Southern Africa at that time at all. When he landed at the Cape, there was a small group of people that would be better known to most as looking like the Bushmen, small, short, big-bottomed, big-bellied, yellow-skinned people called the Khoi Khoi, which is, in a translation of that, is the men of men. And they were the only group, a nomadic group, that had penetrated as far south as sub-Saharan South Africa at that time. And it was only 120 or 150 years after that the Dutch, the Boers, as they called them at that stage, when they started the Great Trek to move inland and get away from Dutch and British rule in the Cape, that they met up with black Africans from the north. So one of the big things that one is told about white South Africans is that we stole the land and dispossessed the noble savages, drove them out, and killed them in their thousands. And that is why they're so violent towards us today. But historically speaking, that is incorrect. There were no noble savages in Africa at that time. So Jan van Riebeck created this station, and they planted vegetables and they traded with the Khoisan for cattle, for meat that they had. But now there were battles with the Khoisan because they, being nomadic people, if it grew, it was for them. It was for the taking.
Yeah.
So the Dutch were planting gardens, and the Khoisan just thought this was a wonderful opportunity to get fresh vegetables and fresh fruit and things. So there were fights between the two groups of people. There's no question about that. But there was no annihilation of the San, as it were. There were scuffles and breakouts of fights between them. Anyway, the Dutch who first came with Jan van Riebeck were indentured servants. And once they bought their way out of their indenturedness, they were given a piece of land to continue growing vegetables for the Dutch. But they were not allowed to sell to anyone or at any other price than those set by the Dutch East India Company. But they were the original Vryburgers, or free citizens. They were the first ones in Africa. And the language Afrikaans, which there's much conflict over in South Africa at the moment, was formed in order to be from Dutch and some German and some French as well, in order to be able to communicate with the local San, because the San have a unique language. It is made up of clicks and almost whistles. And there is no other language in the world quite like it. So in order to communicate with the local people, Afrikaans became the language of note. It's kind of a pidgin Dutch. And it's one of the very few, I think there are only two modern languages that have been accepted in the world as real languages, and Afrikaans is one of them. Just a little side fact on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The only other thing I
Yeah,
can think of pidgin it referred to is the pidgin English that the Hawaiians speak. Like the
yes,
street people speak a different sort of a language there, but it's not
yes,
quite the same because there's no quicks or whistles. It's just like a bastardized version of English that's a lot different with a lot of like Hawaiian thrown in there, and
yeah,
a lot of body language too.
yes.
I don't know if
Well,
you've there was a very interesting there's a very interesting this is just going to take a second to be interesting though, but there's a sci-fi show called The Expanse, but it was based on these books, and like the people who worked in space for generations developed their own languages, and they use like their body language because they couldn't be seen like, you know, gesturing. They couldn't see a shrug in a spacesuit. So if you're in zero G and you're working on something with somebody, they would do like they would add like all these different like kind of like sign language into their dialect, and it was very important to like how they spoke. Like they always spoke with their hands, which was a very very interesting idea and concept when you're talking about that, you know, bring it into, you know, even gestures like into the language, and it's part of it. Like if you don't do it, they know you're not from there.
ah, ah. Well, in Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe, there was also a language developed to speak to the locals. It was called Fanigalo. And
Whoa.
yes, it was for the mine workers essentially, who came from all over Africa and didn't speak English, Afrikaans, French, the languages that were spoken there. So they developed this other language that was spoken amongst them. And I don't know if it's still spoken at all there today, but when I lived in Rhodesia, it was kind of essential to learn Fanigalo. So, you know, the funny things that just this little sideline things to history that nobody ever speaks about.
Yeah.
But I somehow doubt that Afrikaans then, in its rudimentary beginnings, was anything like the language it is today. You know,
Yeah.
I don't imagine it was. But to this day, in the Cape, where they originally landed, the Cape Malays and the coloreds, now these are lighter, they're mixed breed, what you would call here mulattoes, I think.
Hmm.
The coloreds in the Cape, they still predominantly speak Afrikaans as their home language. They don't speak the African tongue anymore. They speak Afrikaans, which will be important when we talk about education later in the show, because it is important to know that a whole race of people other than the white Boers speak Afrikaans.
Hmm.
And it's going to become an important fact later.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there was a lot of scuffling about the Cape. The British took it over from the Dutch, and then they gave it back to the Dutch. And the Boers now, the original Dutch settlers, didn't like living under this liberal, what they considered liberal government of the British, because they were staunch churchgoers and very Calvinistic. They had the French Huguenots who landed there soon after the original settlers had already fled from Europe because of religious persecution. And they didn't want to have any more of this. They didn't want the liberal Anglican British way of living. They wanted their Calvinistic roots. They wanted to be allowed to worship in their own way. They wanted to live by their very, very strict moral code. And so eventually, they started trekking into the great unknown in the middle of South Africa because they did not want to live under these rulers anymore. So they got wagons, which very much the same as the American settlers into the West used, the same covered wagons,
Yeah.
only they pulled them with oxen. And so they were called the ox wagon or the osovar. And they would pack everything they owned, well, as much as everything they owned, into it and set off into the great unknown where literally no foot had stepped before. Because, as I said before, there were no blacks and no whites had actually explored or mapped the interior of South Africa. So they were setting off into absolute unknown through bush and tsetse flies and malaria attacks, and they didn't know what waited for them, but they just knew it had to be better than British rule. So they formed little bands and off they went. And this is when they first met up with the blacks who were nomadic also and cattle herders. So they were coming south in search of better lands, and the Afrikaners were going north in search of better lands. Now, South Africa is divided into really good subtropical areas and then very arid, very dry, very desert-like conditions. So the East Coast and the northern parts of South Africa are incredibly fertile and beautiful. But when you come out of the Cape itself, you go into the Karoo, which is a semi-desert area, and it is horrifically hot and dry. I drove through there a couple of years back, and it's like driving into an oven. It sucks the air out of your lungs. It's so hot,
Wow.
so dry, and so arid. So there had been no reason for anybody to really want to go there, black or white. There was no reason to go to that part of the world. And also, there's a natural barrier called the Drakensberg, the Dragon Mountains, which divides South Africa from north to south. And so the blacks hadn't come there either. Those that were coming north had kind of come as far as the good subtropical area. So the Boers set off and off they went, and they had to take their wagons apart to get them over the Drakensberg. So they had to pull every single possession and every piece of the wagon, and the elderly and the children as well had to be pulled up these mountains on leather thongs called rimpies and taken over the other side of the mountain, lowered down on the other side, and then be put together on the other side of those mountains in order to carry on going. So it was a massive undertaking, and these were tough, hardy people. I mean, you can't just do that if you're not strong, because they weren't supermarkets along the way,
Yeah.
They weren't even farms or anything where they could resupply. So they had to carry everything with them, including their chickens and their cattle, drive them with them in order to eat along the way. And it must have been an unbelievable task. I don't think any of us alive today are fit for that kind of task.
Probably not.
I just don't think we could do it en masse. And we're so used to popping into the supermarket, water coming out of taps, electricity coming out of the wall, turning a light on at night. I mean, these people had to do it all for themselves and still clothe. The women had to provide clothing and blankets and things along the way. It was an amazing undertaking.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, there's people around here that can do some of that stuff, but I mean, it's more scattered. I mean, I live in the middle of nowhere, so a lot of people here do know a lot more than about that kind of stuff than a lot of other people in like the cities say. But I mean,
Yes.
here, like at least people know how to do something. We have like alternative forms of heat, alternative forms of getting water, for example, like wells or especially spring water. Um, so there's a lot of stuff in this area because I'm in the middle of Pennsylvania, where there's
Uh, uh,
in the middle of nowhere really. There's only like 1,000 people in this town, but it's just it's in these like country places. The redneck quote unquote people
mhm.
generally know what they're doing when it comes to survival. They might not all know, but there's people among them that have the pieces of the puzzles that can put it together if there was a major disaster.
No, no, absolutely. I mean, I know because I can slaughter and cut out animals and dry the meat, and I can do canning and those kind of things. But still, we have some modern amenities available
Oh
to
yes.
us. You
And
know,
we even if we went back like to some kind of crash, like we'd still have access to some of our more modern tools, and we would still be able to like start rebuilding technology right away. We'd still have it. It would just require like getting power. And if more
yes,
people knew more about Tesla stuff, like you could build some of Tesla's stuff without too much supplies. If even you were in a collapse scenario, you could find the supplies or talk to the people to put one together because like Tesla's radiant wave generator, if you put up a high enough antenna, you could start repowering the grid. Um, it's very interesting stuff.
yeah, I've read about that, but how many of us know how to do that?
Yeah,
I know
really.
some people who do, but it's not sort of a common thing.
No, no, not at all. I have some of the plans for it. I almost built one myself, but I didn't finish it. So I guess I didn't finish it yet. Eventually,
Yeah.
I plan on it, but whenever that happens.
Mm. Anyway, so here we go now. So they were trekking inland and looking for a place to call their own, where they could speak their own language, worship the way they wanted to, and basically not be told what to do by any government because they rebelled against that and they wanted no part of it.
Yeah.
But they now met up with the Zulu hordes coming the other way. So now we need to speak about the history of those people who were sweeping south, because they were not at that stage the Zulu tribe. They were a whole amalgamation of tribes that had come from as far away as Ethiopia and that far up north, and they were coming down, sweeping everything ahead of them. It was called the Defakani, which was basically a genocide because every tribe that stood in their way, they would just annihilate. They
Hmm.
would take the women and children, some of the children anyway, kill the men, steal the cattle, and take whatever was of value and move on. So it was a disorganized horde of ever growing number of people looking for a better place to live. But that was the first genocide that we know of in Africa, where they killed literally hundreds of thousands of blacks on their way south. But they
Hmm.
were not a coherent tribe at that stage. They later became the Zulu tribe, ruled by Zulu kings, as Chaka, Dingon. Everyone must have seen some part of those kind of movies about the Zulu kings who had the impies and the wonderful armies, etc. But
Yeah.
it wasn't until they became a tribe and had a king that they became a cohesive whole with a common language and a common army, the impies, and a common way of fighting. And they were incredible fighters. They developed military tactics which were amazing in that day and age. They had a thing called the horns, and they would come at you from all angles. So they would come at you from the front, from the left, and from the right, and encircle you and just wipe you out. And they would come silently. And then they would rise up out of the long grass, hissing and beating their spears on their leather shields. And I can imagine the fear that must have put in any adversary's heart, that where there was suddenly this uprising of thousands of them out of the bush. And it must have scared you half to death, never mind the battle itself. Anyway, but they weren't as organized as that when the Boers first met up with them.
Hmm.
Um, but they had battle after battle after battle with these people, um, because they just saw the Boers as first of all, they called them Tagati, which is the white wizard, because they didn't have the wheel. The blacks, they did not have the wheel. They did not have firearms. They did not have wagons, obviously, and they did not have horses. So these strange white people that they came upon in small numbers were an amazing thing to them. So they called them the White Wizards, and they were quite nervous of rifles, obviously. Although those were not rifles like you know them today. They were more the muskets
Yeah.
that you had to put the bullet down, the ball down, and then tamp it down with a rifle rod, and then put a cloth in, and then put, the powder in, etc.
Yep.
So
Black powder rifles.
Yes. What did you call it?
Black powder rifles. Yes.
That's it. That's it. So that's what they
Civil War
had.
as well.
They were marvelous things, but they got incredibly hot.
Oh yeah,
If you
they
buy them.
they're extremely slow to load, so they had to be like
Mhm.
very disciplined when they were using them to like time their shots, try to make them all count. If you were
Yes.
doing single combat, on the other hand, if you're like the tactics of the day were just to like march in giant columns and shoot each other in mass, uh,
Mm.
that really was what they did for the most part. It's pretty bad. It was very chaotic and nasty.
Yep. So what the Boers used to do when they realized that there were other people in this country that didn't mean them well, they formed a laager at night. They circled the wagons, and they put thorn bushes between the wheels so that it wasn't so easy to creep in there. And they always kept watch, and they kept the animals on the inside of the laager to keep themselves as safe as they could.
Yeah.
So okay, so then there was this Battle of Blood River. They were tired of the skirmishes with the Zulus, and a bunch of the Voortrekkers decided that they are going to have a battle at a place of their choosing, because they knew if they laagered for long enough, the Zulus would come. So they, on the banks of which what became known as the Blood River, because of all the blood that flowed that day, they formed a laager of only men and boys. There were no women. And there were about 500 of them, a little more than 500 white Boers. And they prayed for 5 days and 5 nights. And they said, God, if you give us the victory in this coming battle, we and the children that come after us in perpetuity will keep this day as the Sabbath, and it will be a day of thanks to you, which became the day of the covenant, or the day of the vow. It was the 16th of December. Anyway, after 5 days and 5 nights, the Zulu hordes descended on them. Now, there were under 600 whites, and there were approximately, nobody knows because there wasn't time to count, and the black people didn't have numbers, so we couldn't tell, but there were between 15 and 20,000 of them, it is said in the history books, descended on this little circle of wagons. Well, they threw back the first wave, and they threw back the second wave, and they threw back the third wave. And by the end of that day, the Zulus were climbing over the dead. They were approximately, which is also a number that we're not sure of, but approximately 3,000 dead Zulus from that battle when the Zulus withdrew. And there were 3 whites that had minor injuries, not
Wow.
fatalities, minor injuries.
They did a lot better than the Alamo.
Absolutely. That battle has gone down in history as the first and last of its kind, where so few held off so many with so few injuries. They were minor injuries. They were not fatal or life-threatening injuries amongst the whites. And the Zulus withdrew and kind of decided that this wasn't a good plan, and they didn't do this kind of thing again in a hurry. Anyway, after much trekking and much finding a place to settle, some of them went to Natal, which is on the east coast, up north, and the land there is incredible. It is just beautiful. We have a warm current flowing down that side in the sea, so you have a lot of rainfall, and the land is fertile as anything. And some of them settled there, and some of them went further west and northwest kind of, and crossed the Vaal River and decided to settle in what was to become the Transvaal. Now, the ones who settled in Natal, there were some problems with, they had now become the Zulu nation, and there were some problems with the Zulu king. So they sent a party of men under flag of truce to have a meeting with the king and to discuss with him a peace treaty where they would have their own place to live, and they would not attack the Zulus, and the Zulus would not attack them, and they would all live in peace in their own areas. So they went to see the Zulu king, and he said, look, my brother has stolen herds of my cattle, and I'm not prepared to speak to you until you go and retrieve those cattle for me. So after much conferring, the white guys decided, okay, they're going to go and do this. So they set off after the Zulu king's brother, had a huge battle with him, and brought the herds of cattle back to the king. So there was a bit of a party that night in celebration, and also a powwow to talk about signing a peace treaty. And once the king had put his thumbprint on the piece of parchment, saying that this piece of land can now be yours in perpetuity, and we will be at peace with you people, he then shouted out, Bulala Tagati, which means kill the white wizard. And his impis that had been on standby swept in and killed every white man. One of them escaped with the parchment. However, the rest of them were slaughtered.
Oh.
And then the MPs went off on a rampage to find where these men had left their women and children in the wagons, slaughtered them, and this went on for some time where they were just looking for wagon trains and slaughtering every white they could find. So that was kind of the beginning of the problems with black people in South Africa. But they cannot today say that they owned the land and the whites have stole the land from them and now they need to give it back, because that is absolutely historically proven to be untrue. So we were all settlers in South Africa. We came from Dutch and French. The original settlers came from the Dutch and the French in the Cape, and the blacks came down from the north, and we all arrived. Well, they arrived 120 years after the whites, but nevertheless, we were all settlers in that country. It wasn't an inhabited, settled by blacks country that the whites went in and slaughtered them, because that is just incorrect. And it's a thing that people need to understand, because that is the basis of not liking white South Africans, because we did this to the blacks and we deserved what came afterwards. You know, people need to understand that we did not do that. We were all settlers there. Anyway, so the British now had colonized Natal, and the Dutch were still in charge in the Cape, and the rest of South Africa was pretty much unsettled by anybody. There were wandering tribes of blacks and there were wandering Voortrekkers, until the Voortrekkers settled the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, where they created two Boer republics, which were acknowledged by the rest of the world as actual countries. And everything went along fine. We had freedom from the British, freedom from the Dutch. Everything was fine until diamonds were found in the Free State and gold was discovered in the Transvaal. Now, the British had been fighting wars all over the world. Their empire was enormous. There was very little on the map that wasn't pink as belonging to the British Empire. And they needed money desperately. So although they had ignored these two Boer colonies for quite some time, when riches were found there, they saw their chance to make money to support the other colonies and to support their wars. So they stepped in and said, look, they want these. And the Boers, in an attempt at peace, said, okay, well, the ones in the Orange Free State, in any case, they said, okay, we will sell you the land where the diamonds are, and we'll keep the rest of the Free State. We don't want any part of fighting with you. You can have it. It wasn't so easy in the Transvaal, because the gold was discovered in the middle of the Transvaal, so they weren't going to give away that amount of their country, as it were.
Yeah.
But the British were not satisfied with this. They wanted it all. And so came the First and Second World Wars.
Hmm.
Now, the First World War was a very small and short duration, and the British saw no need to bring in troops from overseas or from home. They fought the war, and the war came to an end, and that was that. But the Second World War was the one that is most talked about. And it went on from 1899 to 1902. And the British were so determined to take over the diamond and gold that they brought in literally hundreds of thousands of troops from their colonies to fight this war.
Hmm.
Now, it was a very, very strange war because the Boers had no standing army. They never had a need for it. And they were very loosely ruled. They didn't have rulers who had a standing army and taxes that had to be paid, etc. They were ruled by somebody that they'd voted in, kind of like it would be more like a city council today, I would think, than a government.
Hmm.
Um, they voted the people in, a local person who they trusted, and if they didn't like him, they'd vote him out and put in somebody else. They didn't pay taxes. They had very few rules and regulations,
That's
and
awesome.
as I say, yeah, it was the right way to live. It really was the right way to live, and they were very happy because they were essentially a rural society. They were farmers, so the towns were only there as marketplaces. Um, uh, there was no need uh, for somebody to rule over them. They all came in the town because there weren't very many of their church ministers. So they'd have a thing called Nachtmaal 2 or 3 times a year when a visiting traveling parson would come into town. And all the farmers from all over the place would come in, descend on the town for market days, etc., but also for marriages, christenings, um, those kind of things. They would all happen. They'd have an enormous party. Um, they would have confirmation, and they would take the sacrament, and then everybody would go back to their farms and wait for the next one to come along. So it was that kind of a loosely but closely knit society where when nobody really ruled over anybody else. They didn't have many rules and regulations. They didn't need them because they lived by the Bible and they believed in that thoroughly. So, if God didn't say it, then it didn't happen, and you didn't do it. That was the end of that. Anyway, so now the British want to take over, and they declare war because they want the diamonds and the gold, and they send in troops. But as the Brits, you were talking earlier about mass fighting, where you're fighting a wall of people who're shooting at you, and you're a wall of troops on the other side shooting at. That's how the British understood to fight a war. That you would march in, decide on a place and a time to fight, line up in 2 straight rows, and shoot at each other.
Yeah.
Well, there were never enough white South Africans to do that. They were never, even at the height of South Africa, white rule, were there more than 6 million whites in South Africa. So they couldn't fight that kind of war, and they didn't have a standing army. So the call went out to all the farms. If you're willing to fight the Brits, please be at this place at this time, and with you, you must bring your horse, your rifle, and 8 days' supplies in your saddlebags, and report for duty. So they did. Of course they did, because they were fighting for their freedom, which they had won through trekking and through fighting the Zulus and through all kinds of things. And they weren't going to sit back and let the British take their country. So off they went to war. But now they couldn't face these tens of thousands of Brits because there were not that many of them. So they developed, in the beginning, they tried to fight the war that way, but they were losing horribly. So they developed guerrilla warfare of a kind. They would just appear on these little Boer ponies that they had out of nowhere, attack a supply line, and disappear just as quickly. And they really had the upper hand because the British had to bring their supplies this long way from Natal. So their supply lines were long and had to be guarded. And they were marching into battle with their white pants, their red jackets, and their drummers. And you could see the dust for miles when they were marching. And the Boers were literally hiding behind mountains and laughing at them because every single farm was their supply line. Any Boer at any time could go to the nearest farm, have a hot meal, have a bath, restock, and go back to the war. And of course, he could also leave and go home and harvest his crops and then come back to the war. Nobody was stopping him because he wasn't a paid recruit. He was just fighting because it was the thing to do.
Huh,
So
that's fascinating because
it
that's almost
is,
like they lived almost under a form of anarchy, and that they just
yes.
banded together when they needed to, and then
Hmm.
dispersed when they didn't need to. Like that's beautiful. And
Well,
The
this
Brits had to ruin it all.
absolutely, and they did. But this is still today how the Afrikaner sees life. But you'll see that later in the story.
Yeah.
So so the Boers the Brits took quite a long time to come to terms with this way of fighting, and then they did the unthinkable. They did a scorched earth policy. So every single Boer farm that they came across, they would burn to the ground, salt the earth, poison the wells, and put the women, children, and elderly into concentration camps.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. This was a shocking piece of South African history, and shame on the British for what they did. Now, I've heard excuses that the British were fighting a war, they didn't have enough food for themselves. It was no wonder that they didn't tend to the prisoners. But, even then, there were laws about how prisoners of war were to be treated. And these weren't prisoners of war, they were women and children and elderly people. And they were put in tents, they were not given any food or medical care. They didn't have fresh water. They died in their thousands of disease, cholera, typhoid, starvation. They just died like flies. And the British paid no attention to it. Now, the Boers were essentially winning this war because they were attacking the columns at a rate of knots and being very successful. But when your farm is burnt down, when your wife and children have been killed or died of starvation or incredible disease, when there is no farm to go back to because you'll never grow anything on that land again, or not for generations anyway, what are you actually fighting for?
Yeah.
So, so they quit. The British did not win that World War in battle. They won it by literally killing 20% of the Boer population in
Wow.
those camps. 20% of the Boers were killed in those concentration camps. So now the war ends, and the British are in charge of the two Boer republics. They're in charge of the gold and diamonds, and now they essentially rule the Afrikaners, who are broken. They are absolutely broken. I mean, it is impossible to think how long it takes. Well, after the First and Second World Wars, the length of time it took to replace that population is impossible. And those were men in those wars that were mainly killed. This is the women and children. And there
Yeah.
was nobody to replace them with. They weren't immigrating into South Africa, the Dutch and the French and etc., at a big enough pace to replace the deaths. So the Boer, I think, imagine trying to find your farm, and you can't even find it because nothing exists there anymore, and your family's gone. What do you have really to fight or to live for? That must have been a terrible, terrible time for those Afrikaners. I can't imagine it myself.
No.
Anyway, they picked themselves up and they started again. But now they were living under British rule, and they were chafing at this rule because they always found the British too liberal, too pro-black, and they treated the Afrikaners very much like rednecks, uh, subhuman.
Hmm.
They didn't speak English. They didn't wear fancy clothes. All they wanted to do was farm. They didn't want to pay taxes. They treated them very much like third-class human beings, poor, which they were desperately poor after those wars, and not worth any regard whatsoever. Anyway, so this continued for quite some time, from 1902 till 1948, when for the first time ever, the Afrikaners, the National Party, won an election. And they were now under British rule, but effectively in control of their country. Now, prior to that, in about 1910, the British formed the Union of South Africa, where they put all these homelands, black homelands, which they had created. So they created laws in 1913, but all right, so 1910, they formed the Union of South Africa, and they said that they force integration on all these diverse people. So you've got 11 and more African tribes who all hate each other and are at constant war with each other. Then you've got the Boer folk, and then you've got the British, and they forced all of these into one disparate mess and ruled them. And in 1913, they discovered that this wasn't working so well. So they then created the original apartheid laws, were created by the British in 1913. The land laws, where individual blacks could not own land, but they had their own homelands, where the chief owned the land, and he took care of his tribe. So they fought the no interracial marriage laws, and a whole lot of other ones, which were the roots of apartheid, which were there in 1913, where the Afrikaners only took over in 1948. And you have to understand that although they were the winning party, the country was still ruled by the British.
Yeah.
So the British laws were still in effect. Although the Prime Minister and the cabinet were Afrikaners, we were still under British rule and British law at that time. So even if they had wanted to, they could not have changed those rules and regulations set out by the British in 1913. The apartheid roots were there and they had to live with them. Well, eventually in the 1960s, 1962, we got our independence from Britain and became our own country. We became the Republic of South Africa. But from 1948 onwards, we tried, the Afrikaners tried really hard to bring segregation into effect. So they gave the Zulus Zululand, and they gave the Swanas, the Sothos, Lesotho, and they gave Bechuanaland, which is still Swaziland, Lesotho, and Bechuanaland are still their own countries today. They are not part of South Africa. Swaziland and Lesotho are surrounded by South Africa, but they are their own countries. They're not ruled by South Africa. They're ruled by their own royal families. They have their own tax base. They do their own thing, their own laws, everything. They're not part of South Africa. And
yeah, I saw them on the map.
Yes. Now, all the black tribes were given that opportunity, that they had their own black land ruled by their own kings and their own chiefs, and they lived by their own rules, but they could come into white South Africa to work. Because as I've explained to you, we only ever at the height of white rule only had about 6 million whites. So we never had enough people to work the mines and to create a first world country. There just weren't enough people to do the work. And the black people were still pouring in from all over Africa to get a slice of the cake. There was civilization, there was money, there was an economy, there was expansion, there was modernization. They wanted a piece of it. So during the apartheid years from 1948 to 1994, the black population of South Africa grew by 920%. That is
Oh,
an enormous growth. I mean, the white population didn't grow by anything like that, but the black population grew by that. Now, that was not only immigration from the rest of Africa, that was because their life expectancy increased by 20 years in those years because of modern medicine.
yeah.
There were far less baby deaths at birth and mother deaths at birth because we had modern medicine. So um, thanks to innovation, but still also to a lot more immigration, that population grew by 920%. Now, given that figure, and that is really historically correct, even agreed by the blacks themselves, that is the amount of increase, you can see from that apartheid could not have been what it is seen to be in the outside world. That we killed these blacks by their hundreds of thousands, we dispossessed them, we put them on bits of land where they couldn't grow anything, where they couldn't survive, literally, and we threw them out of our white country.
Hmm.
It's impossible for those two things to go hand in hand.
Yeah.
That population increase and the supposed bad things that we did cannot go together. So, in 1948, the National Party then started tightening up the original apartheid laws that the British had put in place. But I'm not making apologies for apartheid, not at all. I'm just trying to explain how it happened and why more than anything it happened. It was a self-defense mechanism for these people who had fought so hard for their country. And finally, I mean, from 1625 to 1948, they had been ruled by other people and fought endless battles to try and have a piece of place for them to live in peace. So when they finally achieved this in 1948, they said, okay, you can all have your own homelands. Our taxpayers, the white taxpayer, will pay for it. We will give you roads. We will give you hospitals. We will give you schools. We will give you universities. We'll give you running water. We'll give you electricity. We will provide it all from our white tax base. But you will rule yourselves and you will carry a passport if you come into our part of the country. Now, that is another reason for enormous uproar later on in history, was that passport. But they lived in their own countries. They lived in Zululand, they lived in Venda, they lived in Lesotho, they lived in Botswana. To come into white South Africa, they needed a passport to say that they were there legally and that they had the right to be there. But they didn't like this. Anyway, we
I don't
tightened up
really
the
blame
laws.
them.
Sorry?
I said I can't really blame them. I mean, I'm a bit of an anarchist myself to have papers to go, through the same country that you're in. To have to have papers at all is crap. But
I,
I can
I
understand where they're coming from in doing it. I just don't, I'm like I said, I can't agree with
no,
it at
no,
all.
I kind of agree with you nowadays, but what you have to understand, Tim, was that white people also carried a passbook.
Mm,
We carried an ID book. And in that ID book was your birth certificate, your marriage certificate, your firearm license, your everything, your driver's license, everything was in that book. And you had to carry it at all times.
hmm,
You had to have that with you at all times. So they carried a passbook and we carried a passbook.
hmm.
It wasn't like they were being discriminated against, that, oh, well, only if you're black do you need this form of identity. Everybody had to have it.
Okay.
Okay, so the only difference might have been that if I had been stopped by the police and asked for my identity book and I didn't have it, I might have been given a warning and been told to bring it into the police station the following day, whereas the black would have been arrested on the spot.
Mm,
So that was the difference. But we all had to carry one. So Okay, so there were no interracial marriages allowed, and blacks were sent to the back of the bus and had their own waiting rooms and their own. They weren't allowed into white hotels, and exactly the same as segregation here in the States, I think.
Yeah.
From what I read about segregation here, it was exactly the same set of rules, the same thing happening. I don't see any enormous differences, except I do believe that blacks here lived in the same towns as whites.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so in South Africa, they were allowed to, they could work on the mines and live in that town while they were working, and they could be a housemaid, a gardener, and live on your property. It that they were allowed to do, but they couldn't live there permanently. So, in other words, they were not allowed to bring their families and have
Yeah.
a house in a white area at all. That was not allowed until eventually we put Soweto up, which is a Southwest Township, which is its original name, which was built, an enormous suburb built only for black people on the outskirts of Johannesburg. But that was not so early on as in 1948.
Hmm.
They were just not allowed to be in white areas. So it was white by night. And if you were found on those streets and you were black at night and you did not have your pass and could not show a reason to be there, you were immediately arrested. There was no question about it. So
Huh.
South Africa, yeah, I'm stating the facts. I mean, there was good and bad in all
Yeah.
of it. And not all of it was good. But what I'm trying to say is that yes, there was discrimination, but it was not nearly as bad as the outside world was told that it was.
Yeah.
You know, they still lived in their tribal lands, and they still do to this day. The Zulus still have Zululand, and they are still ruled by the Zulu king and the Zulu chiefs, and they pay homage to him, and so on. It
Oh, there we go.
uh,
We'll be back right after the break. Hello, and welcome back to Revising Reality. I'm your host, Tim Kaiser. I'm speaking live with Karin Smith today. We were talking about the current genocide in South Africa. We were covering the historical basis for this. We covered all the way up into the modern era. So, Karin, how are you again?
I'm great, thank you, Tim.
Wonderful. So, what's
So
the next in the step for the modern side of things? Like, as all of this has come together, and we've come to the point where the Africans have taken over their country and they own it basically. Like, what happens from there? What brings us into today with all the killing and the rape and the murder and all this kind of stuff?
all right, so until about the 1970s, things jogged along quite well in South Africa. People, people were mostly happy. It was a first world country. It was clean. It was civilized. Everyone was more or less happy. And I don't know what forces came into play around there. I'm not really sure what happened. Um, but I just want to give you some figures because between 1948 to 1994 there were 21,000 deaths in South Africa. So that's in just under 50 years, 21,000 deaths due to political violence. But those were mainly, and this is from a black author, not a white one, and also from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's numbers, most of those were black on black deaths because there were two parties, black parties, fighting for power in South Africa, the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. And so 92% of those deaths were due to Africans killing Africans. It was not white on black deaths. So I think we need to make that very clear before
Hmm.
we even go any further.
Yeah.
That was the number, 21,000 deaths in almost 50 years. Now we have more than that per year now in South Africa.
Hmm.
We have approximately, well, it depends what figures you look at. But do you want to just go back to the beginning of the violence and to Nelson Mandela before we go further?
Okay.
Okay, so in the 1960s, the ANC decided that a peaceful struggle was no longer possible, and they were not going to win that way. So they formed Nelson Mandela and some others formed the armed wing called MK, which stands for Nkonto Sizwe, which is Spear of the Nation. They formed the armed wing of the ANC and decided that they needed to turn to violence in order to um, get equality and to get the vote and to get all the things that they were denied during the apartheid years.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of black and white people who were exiled from South Africa because of their political violence. And they got the input of the Russians and the Cubans, and they sent a lot of our black exilees to Russia to be trained there in urban warfare. And we also were fighting a war with the Russians and the Cubans and the communists on our northern border. So every single one of the white guys was conscripted into the army after school and had to serve 2 or 3 years in the armed forces on the border, and then do a month or two camp every year after that until he was no longer required. So every single one of our boys fought this communist war on the border, and we had the rest of the world behind us because we were the last bastion against an entirely communist Africa, well, sub-Saharan Africa. So the world was behind us in that fight. But at the same time as that, we were fighting internal guerrilla warfare, where the ANC were planting bombs in police stations, at railway stations, in restaurants, and generally causing total chaos internally in South Africa. So many, many whites were killed in those bombings, and Nelson Mandela, Saint Nelson Mandela, that the world reveres to this day, was the person in charge of that. And he was arrested, and he had 176 charges of crimes against the state and trying to overthrow the state against him. And he didn't even contest 154 of those charges. He said he was guilty. He was quite happy with that. He didn't contest them at all. Now, originally, they wanted to hang the man because the death penalty was still in force, but it was decided not to because they didn't want to make a martyr of him and his co-conspirators. So they put them in jail for life. And from jail, he still had a large say in what happened internally in the ANC. And even Amnesty International, which I believe most people know about, it is a very liberal group that looks at unfair practices around the world. Even they, when they were asked to defend Nelson Mandela, said they could not come to his defense because he was a violent man who was responsible for many, many deaths, and he was guilty.
Yeah.
So even they refused to defend him, which is something that people are not told about Saint Mandela.
That's something that drives me nuts with him and Che. Che, I can't even think his last name. Chavez.
Guevara.
Yeah. Those two figures are like cut into the leftist cloth as if they were gods, and they slaughtered people, they killed people, they were not good people at all.
No,
And they're held up as these great people who were supposedly affected so much good change in the world, and they didn't. They were not good people, and I hate the worship of Nelson Mandela. I mean, in theory, if he wasn't violent about his ideas, then I would have no problem with them whatsoever. But it's the fact that he did violence on other human beings in order to accomplish what he wanted to do is horrible. It goes against everything.
But not only white people, as you saw from those numbers I told you.
Yeah.
That was black on black deaths in a fight for ruling South Africa.
Yep.
And this is where the necklacing thing came in. Winnie Mandela, who is also mother of the nation and practically a saint in her own right, she had a group of young people who carried out her dirty work. And they were called the Football Club. And the football club. And a young guy in that group did not do what she wanted done by him. And she said that none of the normal ways of killing people were severe enough punishment for this young man. His name was Stompy. And she invented the necklacing method. Now, some people don't know about necklacing, but it is a method by which they either cut off your arms beneath the elbows, or they tie your arms to your sides with barbed wire. They tie your legs together. They put 2 rubber tires over you, fill them with gasoline, and set them alight.
Holy crap.
Yeah. And then sing and dance while they witness you dying this terrible, terrible, terrible death.
Wow.
Now, Winnie Mandela said, with our matches and our necklaces, we will take back this country. I mean, she was not even ashamed of that method that she created. And to this day, they still use necklacing, not against the whites, funnily enough, but against their own people.
Wow.
So recently, there was news that leaked into the outside world about the xenophobic attacks in South Africa. The blacks attacking other blacks because they had, particularly Zimbabweans, had left Zimbabwe because they were starving to death there and come to South Africa illegally, the same way that you have this influx of people in your country right now.
Sure.
But, they came into South Africa and they were opening little shops in their backyard or in their house where they would sell flour and cigarettes and sugar and things through the window and creating lives for themselves. Well, the local population said they're taking jobs away from South Africans, although what to stop a South African doing that himself, I don't know.
Yeah.
But they were taking jobs away from them. And so there was a total uprising. They were running through the streets with pangas, a machete, and hacking these people to death, burning down their houses, necklacing them. There were pictures in the international press of some Zimbabweans being necklaced and chopped to death with pangas by locals because these people were stealing their jobs. So that is a method that is still used to this day as punishment for whatever crime they decide you are guilty of. And so one of our ministers in Parliament said that, well, in order to create peace with the Zimbabweans, all they need to do is to tell the South African black people the secrets about running a successful business. Now, if they would just do that and share their secrets with the local blacks, well, then there'd be peace in the country. Now, I don't see that there's a big secret about selling cigarettes through the window of your house, or out of your garage. Anybody can do that.
Yeah.
So, but still, it was a kind of it's their own fault because they have these economic secrets which they're not sharing. So they deserve to be hacked to death, and they deserve to be necklaced because they're doing this. But the ANC government, did not help because they said they were going to deport all Zimbabweans that were there without papers, but they didn't do that. They did the same as here. They gave them a kind of amnesty and a set number of months to get their papers in order. So instead of defusing the situation, they just made it worse by making promises to the local populace that these people are going to go, and they're not doing anything about it. So this is the history of the ANC. They promise the populace anything to get the vote, anything. And then they just don't deliver because they promised them free housing, free electricity, free water, free education, free everything, jobs for all. And they won the elections in 1994 when Mandela came to power. Having with the input from the British and the Americans, sold the white South Africans totally down the river because it was supposed to be a power sharing government that both sides had a say in the governing of South Africa. And that is what the whites voted for at the referendum in 1992. They voted to continue negotiations with the ANC with a view to power sharing. Well, the voters turned out in enormous numbers. 85% of white voters turned out for that referendum, which is an enormous number.
Yeah.
And of that, over 60% voted yes. So it was a huge number of whites that were tired of this war, tired of apartheid, tired of the problems, and just wanted an end to it. But they were sold down the river because the question that they voted yes on never happened.
Sure.
So, okay, but before that, of course, there were the sanctions against South Africa. From everywhere, but particularly the United States, where we couldn't get technology, we couldn't get anything, nothing that came out of the rest of the world could be exported to South Africa. So we were a very closed society. We had our own music, our own everything, because we could not get anything from outside of the world. So we were supporting Rhodesia through their civil war, and we were helping Mozambique. We were fighting the war in Angola against the Cubans and the Russians and the communists. We had this uproar in our own country caused by the ANC wanting to take power. And we were battling. We were really battling. We were highly taxed because we had to pay for the war. We had to pay for this police force. We had to pay for all the homelands. And there were many things that South Africa then had to make for itself. So one thing we do not have in South Africa is gasoline. And so we had to find a way to create it because you can't run a country without it.
Yeah.
So we created Sasol, which makes petrol out of coal. We have an overabundance of coal in South Africa, and we just found a way to convert coal into petrol that you could run your car on.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's a very long and very expensive business. So we never could make enough to keep the country running and keep Rhodesia going and keep Mozambique going and keep the war going. We just couldn't do it. So, okay, so under pressure from the rest of the world, and the red line for the United States was releasing Nelson Mandela. That was the uncrossable, they would lift sanctions, but not until we'd done that. So in 1985, the Prime Minister went to see Mandela, who at this stage was not in prison anymore. He was living in a house on the prison grounds. He had a butler. He had a chef. He was entertaining politicians from all over the world. He had a swimming pool. He had a billiards room. He lived in more luxury than most white South Africans did in his last years in jail, as it were. Anyway, the Prime Minister went to see him and he said to him, look, if you will renounce all violence, we will, without any strings attached, give you your freedom. And Mandela said, I will not do that. So he was kept there because he wouldn't renounce violence. And given that time in history of South Africa, we needed the violence to stop, but he would not.
Yeah.
So they kept him in his luxury house on the prison grounds. But the United States drew that red line and said we had to release him. So in the late 80s, early 90s, the government, behind the backs of the people, started negotiating with Mandela and the ANC towards a power-sharing government. And in 1992, we voted yes. And in 1994, the ANC obviously won the popular vote because we'd given the vote to the black population by then. And Nelson Mandela became president. Now, if you had been in South Africa in that year, you would have understood the hopes and the happiness of all races, all races. The queues for the voting booths went for miles, miles and miles and miles. And blacks and whites alike stood in these queues to go and cast their vote, all talking to each other, all very excited about this fantastic future that our country now had. Well, that didn't last very long, did it?
Hmm.
because no sooner had the ANC come into power than they confiscated firearms from the white population. Now,
Wow.
I told you about our ID book where you had your firearm license.
Yeah.
So in South Africa, they had this register of firearms. You couldn't get one until you got your license through the government to get that firearm, and then you could go and collect it at the gun store. So they knew exactly who had firearms, where you lived, and how many you had. So the ANC government said, okay, people with surname starts with A have got this amount of time to go and hand them in at the local police station. But the police will keep them in lockup until such time as you get a new license through the ANC government, and you will get your original firearm back.
Hmm.
Yeah, funny, very funny.
It sounds like Hitler and all
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
yeah, it was very much like that. But South Africans being incredibly law abiding people and also believing the best from this new rainbow nation that we were living in, had most of their firearms in. There were people who kept some. There's no question about that. But most of them handed them in and dutifully applied for new licenses. Well, there are people who've been waiting 22 years for that new license to come their way. And those firearms, which are locked up in police custody, are disappearing at a rate of thousands per month.
I was gonna
Thousands.
say because even the police here will take things out of the evidence room. I couldn't imagine that those guns are still there. Not at least not all of them. That's for sure.
No, and in South Africa, you can go and hire a gun at a police station for about $11 a day. So the police will rent you a gun and you tell them your name and address. And well, I don't know how it exactly works, but because it's very under the counter thing. But you can go and hire a gun. Now, do they honestly think that someone who's coming to hire a handgun is doing it for some
To
really?
practice or something, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I'm just going down to the gun range quickly to, so hire me a gun for 3 days and then I'll bring it back. So that very gun that you so law-abidingly handed in could be the one that's used to kill you,
Yes,
you know.
that's
And also firearms have disappeared by their thousands from the Defense Force, which is now also almost entirely black. So, they just disappear. End of story. They're not there anymore. Um, and I'd love to tell the story about the Air Force. So the Minister of Defense was asked recently, why are we sending our young pilots to be trained in other countries when we have a perfectly good Air Force right here? And she said, no, at the end of apartheid, when the whites were fired to make place for blacks, they took the airplanes home with, sorry, they took them home with them and put them in their own private museums. And that's why we have no Air Force anymore. So
that's funny.
I had this picture of some fired Air Force pilot putting it in his briefcase and sneaking it out of the compound that way. I mean, honestly, it's unbelievable, but everything is the whites' fault. Everything is apartheid's fault. The fact that they have not maintained these aircraft and they've fallen to pieces, that is not, that's not mentioned. It was the whites who stole them. Now, you can't steal a whole air force, you know. Then
Wow.
and then I'm going to tell you another funny just about the Defense Force as well. So the Navy wanted new submarines, and they got one, and they were asked now what was so fabulous about the submarine, and why did they need them so badly? So this guy, you can look it up on YouTube. It's there. The interview with him is there on YouTube. He says, well, we've got sharks, and we use these submarines to chase the sharks away so they don't bite people when they swim in the sea.
Wow.
And this is our admiral of our navy who thinks that submarines are to chase sharks away. I mean, honestly, Tim, from a first world, incredibly creative, uh, productive, wonderful, clean, law-abiding, great country to this. to this in 21 years.
Yeah. Wow.
Our electricity. And now here you have a whole bunch of different electricity suppliers, depending what state you live in. Now, in South Africa, you have one, which is Eskom, which is a parastatal. It's partially owned by the government. And they have coal power stations in South Africa. Now, in 21 years, they have not been maintained. So they showed photographs of one power station, which is just covered in ash. Now, you know ash and water is acidic, so it's eaten away the metal in the power station, etc., etc. So plus they steal the electricity wires for the copper in them. So there are huge areas of South Africa which have no electric wires, because no sooner do you replace them than they get stolen again. So, okay, so for the last 2 years, we've had load shedding by Eskom, which means that for certain times of the day, it started out an hour a day, but it's ended up sometimes a week in an area, they just turn the power off to your area. Now, imagine this. How do you run a business where the electricity is turned off for an absolute week? You can have a generator, but if you can't get diesel for your generator, because Eskom, who creates the electricity, has bought up all the diesel to create electricity with. So, yes, now you can't run your generator. So how do you run a business? You've got no lights, you've got no refrigeration, you've got no till point running, you've got nothing. How do you run a business?
Wow.
But worse than that, Tim, they publish in the newspapers which area is going to be load shedded for how long and which days. Roadmap for the criminals.
Wow.
An absolute roadmap, because
then if you don't have the power, you don't have the light to see them at night, you're in defenseless type of mode. You don't even have a gun.
But this is the thing. In South Africa, it crept up on us. You replaced your friend. Well, you first put burglar bars on your windows and security gates on your doors. Then you replaced your fence with an 8-foot wall. Then you put electrified wiring on top of that wall, because they come over them anyway, or broken glass or spikes on top of the wall. So you have an electric gate leading into your property. You have electric wiring on top of your wall. You have an electric-driven alarm system. You have a phone that depends on charging, and you have a PC that depends on electricity. So if you have load shedding, those batteries for your gate, your alarm system, your PC, your telephone will only last so long.
Yep.
And then they run out. So you have no defense whatsoever. Plus, the criminals have the roadmap to your house, because they know that that street is not going to have power for a week.
Yeah.
So you are literally, every single expensive defense that you have has been taken away from you, plus an invitation to the criminals to come and home invade you, keep you prisoner, torture you, rape you, kill your kids, boil them in boiling water, hang them from the rafters, etc., and then leave, having not stolen anything. Not a thing gets stolen. So we don't have figures. So I'm giving you the popular figure, but I cannot tell you that this figure is correct. It could be many, many more, and it could be a couple of thousand less, because the police do not report crime by race. And in fact, the newspapers and everybody is not allowed to report on crime. So the police come out whenever they feel like it with the crime figures for the year, and they are seriously wrong, which has been proven by the figures from the morgues and the figures from the police. There's no similarity between them. However, it is estimated that up to 90,000 white people have been brutally tortured, burnt, raped, hacked to death since 1994. So that's in 21 years in a country 1.5 times the size of Texas.
Wow.
At this moment in time, this year, there are 2 of these white people murders every single day. There are 90 plus murders a day in South Africa. But at least 2 of these murders of whites, torture murders, have taken place every single day this year. Now, if this were happening in Texas, would there not be a national outcry?
Yeah. You'd
If
think
you,
so. Now you'd think so because like there's that thing with the Flint water thing now. The problem with
yeah,
the Flint thing is that like Pennsylvania's water is actually worse than Flint's. There's some places that are like 9 times that amount in Pennsylvania. We're talking about Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
yes,
So,
yes,
I mean, it's controlled here, but the word does get out because I mean I've heard about it, so obviously somebody's paying attention to it enough to like put me in the know when I found their article. One of my friends tipped me off to that one, but like even like it's here it's controlled as well. You know what I mean? Like the media is definitely controlled. You have the alternate media, but that's I've been doing research into the idea that the CIA is partially behind that via Project Mockingbird extensions,
yes, yes,
which because I mean there's been interesting things that have not been reported on and did not make it into the thing, especially say. I mean, do I want to name names? But I would definitely say Alex Jones. And there's some other bigger names that are like connected to that hub where they're absolutely not putting out the full truth and they're doing it on purpose,
yeah,
using it to divide and
yes,
sway people.
yes,
So I mean, yeah, I mean you're right. You'd think there'd be a public outcry. I mean, if something crazy like that happened, yeah, there'd be a public outcry. But it takes a little while for it to gain traction here because people are, apathetic and selfish and they don't really care. And when they do start caring, then they usually end up being controlled by whatever, side the powers that be want them to step into. Like you got Black Lives
yeah,
Matter versus,
yes,
the
yes,
militias or whatever. You know what I mean? Like that's what they're trying to provoke. So by creating these things, and it's possible that the controllers in our world are obviously funding and helping this guy, who's in power over there now, because this is what they want. They want chaos, they want destruction, and so this is like the spillover of all that into there.
yes, yes, absolutely. So now, to come to today, we now have over 141 race-based laws that exclude white people, and now increasingly Indians, not American Indians, Indian Indians, in South Africa from the job market. So what that is that each big corporation has a monthly scorecard, a BE scorecard, and on that scorecard they're scored by how many black people there are in upper management, middle management, lower management, etc., etc. They are scored on how, if you give to a charity, for instance, and you give to a white charity, less than 90% black anyway, you then lose points. So if you want a government contract, you have to be sure that you pass that scorecard every month, plus all your suppliers also have to be BBB, broad-based Black Economic Empowerment compliant. You have to be compliant or you will never get government contracts.
Wow.
So, so it has become a thing that, and if you have your own business, you have to have a 51% black partner. Now, whether the partner works in the business or adds anything to the business doesn't matter. You have to have them. So you now, whites have been disenfranchised and dispossessed and thrown out of the job market. If you have a job, hang on to it because you will never get another one. That is just a literal fact. So there are an estimated 3.5 million white people remaining in South Africa. Nobody knows because no census has been done, but that's estimated. And out of that, another estimated figure is 1 million of that 3.5 million are living in abject poverty.
Hmm.
Because if you lose your job, you will soon thereafter lose your home, your vehicle, your child's education,
Yep.
and end up on the streets because there are no government grants or safety nets for white people. Blacks will get government grants for medicine, for food, for child allowances, etc., etc. But the white people do not get these things.
Hmm.
So if you have lost your job, It is literally a death sentence because you will end up on the streets. The street is not a place for a white family to be because they will be murdered and tortured and whatever. So what has happened in South Africa is that some kind people who have got empty tracts of lands have made this piece of land available for the white people to go and squat on. So they're not squatters in the sense that they don't have permission to be there, but they're squatters in the sense that there's no water supply, there's no electricity, there are no houses, there's no nothing. They just have a piece of land where they can gather in numbers to have a sense of some sort of sense of safety in that country. So now what do? They have this piece of land, so now what? So they build little shacks out of, they park a battered old caravan there, or put up a tent, or build a shack out of road signs, pieces of wood, whatever and whatever. But they still don't have food, clothes, water, ablutions, nothing. They have nothing. And the problem is growing at a rate of knots because with the latest new laws that they want to pass in South Africa, in fact, are being signed right now, what they're saying is that commercial property, residential property, your any patents you own, anything you own, your intellectual property, can be taken away from you without compensation if it's in the national interest. So they don't have to prove it's in the national interest.
Yeah.
They just to tell you that they want to take the stuff away from you. So there is no, the foreign companies are leaving. Anglo-American, which has been part of South Africa since the very beginning, is packing up and leaving. So the white miners are being paid off, and thousands of people now in the next few months will be added to the already million that have no job and no future. Wow. So there are some charities that have gotten together out of the kindness of their hearts and are collecting donations for these people. So they take them food, and they take them clothes, and they take them blankets, and they take them beds, and they help them to build shacks and schoolrooms, etc., on these pieces of property. But there are not enough people, white people, working in order to be able to keep this up. So they depend entirely on cash from outside of the country, because you can't take a kid to a doctor and give them the doctor a bag of apples. You know,
wow.
He's not going to do it for that. And now white South Africans don't have money. So food and clothes come in, but food is becoming even more scarce nowadays because the prices have gone up so much because of the current drought, and the number of farmers that have been, their land has been taken away, and the number of farmers murdered. So food is becoming a scarce commodity in South Africa as well, and very expensive. So these charities depend on the outside world to help them. But you cannot send goods to South Africa, because if you do, recently a container load of clothes was sent from Australia to South Africa, and they have to pay 70,000 Rand in taxes to get those goods handed over to them at the docks.
Wow.
So they can't do that. They don't have the money to do it. So sending things through the post, you can't do. The post office is in disarray. The airways won't take parcels because the post office doesn't pay its accounts, etc. So you cannot, and they get stolen. So you can't send aid parcels in the mail to South Africa. You can't send things there at all. But for now, you can still help financially, which is the thing they need the most, because in order to buy building materials and grass and seed, and they need cash.
Yeah.
And there is not enough people in South Africa to give them cash.
Yeah.
So that is the best way that we can help them. And there is, you have it on your website, on your page.
Yes, I do.
Really good charity, South African Family Relief Project, that works hand in hand with all the other reputable charities in South Africa. So if you donate to them, it will not stay with them. It will go where it is most needed. So if another charitable foundation needs $1,000 today, and a South African Family Relief gets it in today, it will go to them. So they are a really, really good charity that grew out of nothing. A young couple who were in that same situation themselves pulled themselves up by their bootstrings and started using their own time, their own money, their own everything to help those worse off than themselves. And they are still in charge of this charity, which has grown exponentially and now covers the whole of South Africa. But they are struggling desperately for funds.
Yeah.
So that is the best way that we can help South Africans right now, is to donate. Look, the exchange rate is 15 Rand to $1. So $5 is a lot of money in South Africa, and we can all afford to give $5.
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't there what's the other thing you were saying about they're working on some people trying to get out, some people trying to deport, some people trying to provide asylum? You said something about there was some
Yes,
kind of way for them to start to try to get out. Some people were looking towards that too, because if the country's so horrible right now, I mean, I personally I would try to leave. I mean, I know that they're poor, so it's like one of those things where too bad, like you know how United States
yes.
deports Mexicans. Why in the world
Yes.
wouldn't South Africa just deport the ones that they don't want, the whites? Because why wouldn't that be an option? Just it'd be so much easier. Just send them, give them money for a plane ticket and send them out. Send them somewhere.
I'll tell you why. Because if they do that, they're then going to get rid of the majority of their tax base. Because 85% of the taxes are paid by the few working whites.
Oh,
So if they start saying, okay, whites can leave, they're going to lose their tax base.
yeah,
And that's the same reason why they will not give them self-determination, which many whites are fighting for. They refuse to leave. They've been there. Their families have been there. That's their country. They want self-determination, their own place where they can live. But the government is not going to give it to them because they lose their tax base.
yeah.
And they're not going to do that. So on my website, you will find, which is radiofreesouthafrica.com,
I have that
you
linked
will
on my
find,
site as well.
yeah, you will find a donate button there. Now, the donations that I take have gone to help people to get tickets, people who can get visas, which is very hard to come by for a white South African. It is extremely hard to get a visa to leave that country. But my website, I collect funds in order to help people to get out. So I will pay for their visa, I will pay for their air ticket, and I will pay for any legal fees once they get wherever they're going. Or at least that's the plan. I have helped 5 families so far who
That's
have
awesome.
applied for asylum and are waiting. But it can take up to 7 years. And in that 7 years, of course, they don't have a work permit. So they still need help through
Yeah,
that time. And even then, they can still be deported back to South Africa. So it's a very difficult situation.
yeah.
But that is one of the things I'm doing. And the other thing that I really want to speak about is who helps the helpers.
Yep.
So you have these people who work for these charities, but they do not get a salary. They do not take 1 cent from those donations, because the one lady told me she could not sleep at night if she thought that she had eaten that day at the expense of somebody who hasn't eaten for a week.
Hmm.
So they don't take a can of food. They do not take a penny out of those donations, because they have to make the decision every single day who eats and who doesn't. There's not enough to go round. So they have to look these people in the eye and say, we don't have food for you today. And they have to make that call. Who
Wow.
do we help today? So they themselves will not take a penny. Now, one of these ladies is extremely ill right now and does not have money to go to the doctor. Now, if these people fall by the wayside because they cannot take care of themselves, the whole charity is going to collapse. And then these million people, including 350,000 children, are not going to get any help.
Wow.
So I think that I'm going to make it my job to help the helpers,
Hmm.
to make sure that they have a decent place to stay, tonight, that they don't end up in a camp, and to make sure that they have food to eat and clothes to wear. And that is going to be, and I'm not going to stop helping people get out. If they can get a visa, I will certainly help them financially to get out of there. But I really think that if the few small handful of people who are helping over 1 million people, if they fall by the wayside, there is no hope for the white dispossessed people in South Africa. We need to help them.
Yeah.
So if you want to donate to help the people who are in the camps or going to be in the camps shortly, then please go to South African Family Relief Project and donate there. I can guarantee you that every cent you donate gets used where it is most needed. It gets used for food and it gets used for buildings. South African Family Relief delivered on Friday the last final building materials needed to put up 2 schoolrooms at one of the most terrible camps in South Africa. This is a camp where the government has put these people on top of an unreconstituted garbage heap at Munseyville, where the houses had no foundation. So in the first wind they blew away, they found their houses 2 blocks away. The houses are made of corrugated iron. They get extremely hot in the summer. You can burn yourself on the iron that the houses are made of. They don't have windows. They don't have any ventilation. They don't have floors. The floor is this mucky garbage heap. So South African Family Relief put floors in the houses, and they put grass in for the kids to play on, and they're now building 2 schoolrooms so that the children get basic education.
That's very good.
Yes, and they're also hoping to buy a farm where they can put these people to be self-sufficient. They can grow their own vegetables. They will have goats, meat goats, and they will have chickens, and they will have some sheep and cows, and they will reskill these people into making things like burglar bars and security gates, which are in high demand in South Africa.
Yeah.
And that money will go directly to the people, not to the charity. And they will be self-supporting.
That's awesome. They should look into permaculture and I bet you they already are looking into permaculture, but permaculture and the aquaponics type stuff like that, where you can feed a lot of people off of a very small amount of land, and you can, you can raise fish at the same time you raise, because if you're in warmer temperatures, it would be really easy to raise lots of tilapia in some sort of like small greenhouse type thing to start, and then keep expanding on that. That's something that they should really look into. I know there's a lot of good stuff on the internet about how to set those up, like YouTube and stuff. I know that information could fall into their hands pretty easily. And since, you're directly in contact with them, that'd be really good to do. That website, by the way, is safrpsa.org for those, who aren't going to end up going to any of the websites. Because the show Revising Reality website, revisingreality.com, I also have links to this, and I'm going to put up some other videos about the history of South Africa and other things in Africa in general in the show notes for this show after the fact. Either today, it'll either be there tonight or they'll be there tomorrow.
But as I say, I have known these people. I've worked with them for 3 years. I know that there are many, many charities in South Africa which are just putting money into their back pocket and not helping.
Yeah.
But I know that this charity and the 2 others that they work with, the VAS Foundation and Miljoen Stemme for Steve, they all work together. They are honest as the day is long. They can account for every penny. And they know how to stretch a penny to make copper wire out of it, I'm telling you. They are incredible people. They work very, very hard. You can go to their website. You will see every single day what they've done. So you can see for yourself what has been achieved, what is happening, what their next plan is. They are very, very good people. And then if you would like to help people to get out of South Africa and to maintain themselves while they get settled somewhere else, or to help me help the volunteers, you can go to my website and donate there. I don't know how best to tell you how to help these people other than that, because we are finding it extremely difficult to get them visas to go anywhere, even for a visit. It just seems that the world has slammed their doors in our faces. And the one person who did get asylum or refugee status in Canada, the ANC stepped in and had that reversed. So I don't know what the answer is, but I had a wonderful show last night with the vice president of Alliance for Peace and Freedom, and they are negotiating with the Belarus government to get South Africans land there without too many visa problems, etc.
Well, that's good.
Yes, and there is a lot of rich land in South Africa. The government is, in principle, agreeing with it, but there's a long way to go with that, so still to go. But there are people out there trying to help white South Africans. I just fear that it's too little too late, because things are speeding up terribly. And if the ANC were to be ousted in the next elections, the people who will step in are the economic freedom fighters led by Julius Malema, and that would be the death knell for whites totally, because he is all for nationalization. His election banner says the honeymoon is over for whites in South Africa. He says the whites are crybabies and they must just go back where they came from. Their time is short if this man should get into power in South Africa.
Well, maybe he's smart enough to just support him then, if he really thinks they should get out. I mean, I'm just saying, I know he's not going to do that, but I mean, that's
they make it so difficult. You need, in order to immigrate, and I've been through this myself, you need an unabridged birth certificate, an unabridged marriage certificate, you need a tax certificate, a tax clearance, and a police clearance. Now, to get those things out of the South African government is a 2 or 3 year mission. And when you get them, then they're wrong. I got my unabridged marriage certificate, and it said that my husband, who was born and bred in America, was born in South Africa. So you then have to take it back and start again. And it can take you 4 years to get those papers. So they're not making it easy for you to leave. They don't want you, but you're the common enemy, which combines all these disparate tribes. Instead of hating each other and fighting each other, they fight the whites. So that is to their advantage to keep the dreaded enemy there. And they do their best to do exactly that. So, the doors slam in your face no matter which way you turn.
Yeah.
It is so difficult for these people, and my heart breaks for them. But I can only do what I can do, and I'm only one person.
Yeah. It's sad. I mean, all this stuff, just all the pain and suffering and sorrow caused. And these people are using the power of the state to do all this, because if it weren't for that, they wouldn't have anything. They wouldn't have a way to stretch out and destroy their fellow man except for indirect action, which if you had like a country with no laws like they were before, like they were in the past, like the Boers lived, then they just defend themselves and that would be it. Like it would be done.
But
it's
that's
ridiculous.
all they are asking for, Tim. To this day, it was practically guaranteed in the CODESA talks in South Africa that they could have self-determination. Well, they have applied and applied and applied and applied to just talk about it.
Yeah.
And the government won't even come to the table to talk about it. And even though Genocide Watch has put white South Africans on stage 6 of 8 levels of genocide, the world is saying there's nothing wrong in South Africa, so we don't need to declare them endangered people, so we don't need to help them. Wow. So what do you do? What do you do?
I don't know, except to try to help. Try to find a way. Unless you just, I mean, I don't know a way to move 1 million people. Like, you know what I mean? Like, just as an example, like, I mean, you'd have to, if you were gonna like just forcibly deport them, and I mean by force, I mean just everybody just picks up and leaves without asking for permission. But that's almost impossible. You'd have to go back to the horse and wagon shit, or you'd have to like try to sneak out, and it's too many people.
And where you gonna go?
Yeah,
to an African country surrounding you who hate you just as much, who's got rid of the colonials in the last 20 years, they've also all, I mean, it's the last outpost of a white natural population in Africa.
So I have a project for everybody then. We should all figure out how to steal a cruise ship. Take it down there,
Yes.
as many as we can, then just need to shake it out of there to like Madagascar or someplace that's okay with this, and then just like drop them off and then go back and get another load. Each time dock
Well,
to a different place, you know what I mean? But you gotta I think that's not really that bad of an idea. Anyway, Karen, it's been great, and great having you on, and we'll have to have you on here again some point. This has been a Revising Reality, and it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for all who listened.